Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Chavi Kapoor, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my heartiest welcome to you all to this IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we are here for a distinguished lecture on gender, peace, and security by Professor Meenakshi Gopinath. This discussion is a part of our series, The State of Gender Equality, #Gender Gaps, organized by IMPRI Gender Impact Study Center. I'd now like to call Anshana Mehta, Senior Assistant Director at IMPRI, to introduce our eminent speaker and panelists for this session. Thank you. Over to you, Anshana.
Thank you, Chavi, and good evening, everyone. It's indeed my privilege to introduce our speaker for today to you all, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath. She is currently founder and director of WISCOMP, Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, an initiative of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility that seeks to promote the leadership of South Asian women in the areas of peace, security, and regional cooperation. She is also Principal Emerita of Lady Shri Ram College, New Delhi, where she served as principal for 26 years and is also chair of the Board of Governors of Center for Policy Research, CPR. Dr. Gopinath was the first woman to be nominated to the National Security Advisory Board, NSAB, of India. She is a member of multi-track peace initiatives and people-to-people dialogues in South Asia. She has authored, among others, Pakistan in Transition, and co-authored Conflict Resolution, Trends and Prospects, Transcending Conflict, a resource book on conflict transformation, and Dialogic Engagement, and has contributed chapters and articles in several books and journals on Gandhi, the politics of Pakistan, conflict resolution, gender and peace building, among others. In recognition of her contribution to the field of women's empowerment, she has received several awards, including the Padma Shri Award. She has also received the Celebrating Womanhood South Asian Recognition Award for Social Harmony, the International Lifetime Achievement Award 2009 for outstanding work in the field of justice, equity, peace, and progress, and the L.M. Singhvi Fellowship Award at the David Davies Memorial Institute of International Studies, University of Wales, Aberystwyth. She has also received the honoris causa for significant contribution to the education of women and the commitment to fostering global peace through conflict resolution from the La Trobe University, Australia. She has also been a distinguished visiting scholar at the School of Social Sciences at Monash University, Australia. Dr. Gopinath is also a member of the Non-Violent Peace Force International, is on the Council of UPeace, a United Nations mandated university, and is editor-in-chief, Peace Prince, a South Asian journal of peace building, New Delhi. She has been a Fulbright Scholar and has received several fellowships, including the Australian International Education Foundation Fellowship and the University Grants Commission Indo-Israel Exchange Fellowship, among others. Ma'am, we are honored to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. We are also joined by our two panelists, Dr. Rina Kashyap, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Lady Shri Ram College for Women, LSR, University of Delhi, and Dr. Soumita Basu, who is an Assistant Professor in International Relations at the South Asian University, New Delhi. I welcome all our participants for today. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath to deliver her talk. Ma'am, it's over to you.
Thank you, Anshula, and good evening to all. Thank you for that very generous, if not entirely accurate introduction. I didn't quite recognize myself in it, but thank you. It's also such a great privilege for me to be here amongst you in the midst of women and men whose ideas and scholarship and work propel us to engage with the possibilities of a more inclusive and secure and humane world. IMPRI has been a hub from which substantial expertise in myriad fields has emanated. And therefore it's with some trepidation that I address you all today, even as I'm thankful to Professor Arjun Kumar and the IMPRI team for their very, very indulgent invitation. I'm also very grateful to my colleagues, Professor Rina Kashyap and Professor Soumita Basu, for making time to engage with these ideas this evening. My talk attempts to focus on engendering security, and it's an attempt to foreground some of the challenges and opportunities for peace building in the South Asian region, especially when seen through a gender lens. It also reflects the quest for an alternative vocabulary by highlighting some of those concerns, especially of that half of the population, women, who hold up half the sky and whose voices are often not heard in the meta-narratives of national security. And it also draws on the current international discourse that has placed women, peace, and security as a high priority for the global systems of governance, which is why Professor Basu's presence here today is particularly encouraging. The year 2020, as we all know, was a watershed year, not always in positive ways. While it will long be remembered as a year when we were engulfed by COVID, it significantly marked 25 years of the Beijing Platform for Action, 5 of the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and the new Global Compact, and 20 years of the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. And together, these provide the confluence of the global normative compass of this millennium that scripts or rescripts the gender, peace, and security agenda. Collectively, they envision a global contact and establish the link between development, peace, security, environment, gender, and democracy. So in October 2000, as the slide will show you, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1325, which affirms the important role that women play in the prevention of armed conflicts and peace building. And it called on all actors, the state, UN, and non-state, to support and increase women's participation in decision-making pertaining to prevention and the resolution of conflict and reconstruction. I'll not repeat what it says on the slide, but there were also 10 other resolutions that went on to make the women, peace, and security agenda. And taken together, these 11 resolutions make up the formal global women, peace, and security agenda and cover a whole gamut of concerns. They guide work to promote gender equality and strengthen women's participation, protection, and rights across the conflict cycle, from conflict prevention through post-conflict reconstruction. And there are also supporting resolutions 2272 and 2331 enacted in 2016 that address issues of sexual violence, rape, and abduction as a weapon of war and exhort zero tolerance for all forms of gender-based violence. Together, they represent a global codification of principles that underline dignity, rights, and bodily integrity for women. I believe that 1325 began a series of conversations that enable us to interrogate the ethnocentric, anthropocentric, and androcentric notions of security. And it was significant because 1325 was really not a top-down, but a bottom-up kind of resolution, even though it came from the UNSCR. It emerged from the experience of women's activism at the grassroots. It was a result of extensive lobbying by NGO working groups post-Beijing and also the UNIFEM. And it was initiated significantly by the Global South when Namibia was chairing the UNSCR. Anwarul Chaudhry of Bangladesh was also a prime mover and gave it further impetus when he represented Bangladesh at the council. So contrary to what is perceived that it's very much now being appropriated by the global north, it really originated out of the aspirations of the global south for recognition of women's roles in conflict transformation, and also about the differential impact on women of conflict. It was built on a major paradigm shift on understandings of security, and it was an expansive notion of building peace. It really opened an accordion. And as I said, it did not emerge in a vacuum. It followed the exhortations of the Beijing platform that contained an entire chapter on peace and security. And it had taken on board the particular impact of war and women and the widespread sexual violence seen in the civil wars in Bosnia and West Africa and Rwanda in particular. And it was the result of years of hard work. And so it was really a trajectory, a process that encompasses several ideas of participation, of representation, and of democracy. And it's important that as we tick the boxes on the various guidelines that come out of the UN today, we must be clear that it doesn't get sanitized into box ticking efforts. In some ways, the two ends of the spectrum of 1325 are represented by 2467 that was adopted in 2019 and was really a survivor-centered approach on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. That was one end of the spectrum. The latest is 2558, adopted in 2020, that affirms the link between development, peace, and security and human rights. And they interlink them and demonstrate that they are mutually reinforcing. So 1325 plus, as it has come to be known today, is a continuous work in progress. And peace building, as you know, is a verb, not a noun, and it can be a bumpy road, and it depends very much on the everyday resistances and daily mutinies that women engage in, perhaps not always in very spectacular ways. And the conceptualization itself has evolved just as perceptions have changed. And this is where I thought I might recall something that Jo Wellacott, who started her career as an air engine mechanic and later as an air engineer during World War II, and quit it to become a pacifist. She was an incredible woman. She was a suffragist, a pioneer on the study of women's history. She died in 2019, and in 2017, at the age of 95, she published her biography called Living and Learning in Peace and War. It's an incredible history of women's engagement in conflict and peace building. And she said something like this. She said, you know, when I looked at the word women, peace, and power and tried to bring them together, they did not quite fall into place because the word woman took on a very sickly, flat, grayish, pinkish color, very innocuous and very ineffective. And the word power, on the other hand, took on a very scarlet and crimson sheen, threatening and almost sinful by association with women. And then I moved the word woman off, and it took on a very peculiar, ill-shaped question mark that hung over it. And when I tried to put these words together, they just did not speak to each other. But then in a short time, she says, I found that the problem lay with the spectacles I was using. And these were the spectacles of the world. And then I took them off. And when I put on my new spectacle, I saw something very different. And this was what she said 35 years ago. And things have indeed changed. So if you look at the traditional concept of the woman who makes peace, a woman in white, the lady in white, like Florence Nightingale, as the next slide will show you, almost ethereal, luminous, surreal, surrounded by white doves. But women's peace-building efforts are situated in a theoretical framework that sees violence as resourcelessness and peace as power. And it seeks to look through a lens that engenders security. So the traditional view of women as peacemakers, as passively holy or wholly passive, needs severe interrogation. And as you see below, you see the images of women in black. Now, Women in Black is an international network of women who resist war. It's a 10,000 strong network. It started in Israel, but it has spread all over the world. Here you see women protesting the war in Bosnia, and you've also had a collective of women in black in India in 2015 that were protesting fundamentalist incorporations of women in movements for freedom and articulation. And so we all know that a stable situation is not necessarily a peaceful one. And women know this extremely well. And very often injustice, exploitation, and discrimination are incompatible with real peace. So the call today is for peace with justice. So a peace-directed person may be one on whom it is laid to challenge the system, rock the ship of the state if necessary, something that Rosa Parks did. And as the next slide will show you, Rosa Parks, just by sitting quietly but stubbornly, asserting her right to human dignity, refusing to get off that bus. It was a segregated bus in Alabama in 1955. She did not at that time see herself as a troublemaker. She decided that she was not going to be a nigger for anyone anymore. And all she knew at that point was to sit still, and she was glued to her dignity. And she got hauled off to jail and into history, as you know, lit the fuse for social dynamite. And today the slogan goes, and that Rosa sat so that Martin could walk, and Martin walked so that Obama could run. And we have seen contemporary instances of this kind of taking on, rocking, in some senses, the ship of the state. We've seen instances at Shaheen Bagh, the activism of women farmers at Tigri, Ghazipur, Singur borders of Delhi, and also other parts in our own country. Of course, not to mention the many, many initiatives by women all over the world. So the question emerges, whose peace are they disturbing? And what is the peace that we are talking about? Recently, Urvashi Butalia wrote a very evocative article which said, we are saved by our women. Our democracy in many ways is saved by our women. And of course, she mentioned Devangana Kalita and Natasha Narwal, Disha Ravi, and Navsharan Kaur, who work really to show that women's place can be in the resistance. And therefore, what are they doing? Are they doing peace? Or are they changing simultaneously the discourse on security? And as we all know, the changing discourse on security is influenced by the human security paradigm and critical security studies. And it interrogates the agenda of realism and its definition of politics, which was based on the centrality of the state and its sovereignty, and arguing largely from an emancipatory perspective and foregrounding the imperatives of security conceived as freedom from want and freedom from fear. We can't but remember Mahbubul Haq's very evocative articulation of human security in the Human Development Report of 94, where he said human security is a child who did not die, a disease that did not spread, and you know how much salience that has for us today, a job that was not cut, an ethnic tension that did not explode in violence, a dissident who was not silenced, a human spirit that was not crushed. These are the underpinnings of security and not a concern with weapons. It is a concern of human life and dignity. So feminists have pointed out how the security-seeking behavior of states is legitimated by its association with certain types of hegemonic masculinity. And they have interrogated the strategic language of foreign policy and defense discourse and shown how they shape, legitimate, and constrain certain policy options. We all know Cynthia Enlow's work here. And therefore, the evolving contours of security help foreground the issues that are integral to feminist perspectives. The question of realism, the notions of security as a zero-sum game, the critique also of the separation of the public sphere from the private sphere, the critique of war, gendered citizenship, and populist nationalism, and the emphasis on respecting difference in democratic arrangements. And of course, last but not least, the connection between patriarchy, militarism, intolerance, and violence. And as Sarah Rudick once said, the rational calculus and the self-interested language of realism and power brokerage flies in the face of the philosophy of connectedness and cannot be redeemed to serve feminist purpose. So if women do speak in a different voice, as Kate Gilligan has said, they're looking to usher in a new kind of counter-hegemonic politics where existing notions of power will definitely stand inverted. And feminist scholars have shown how the reified language of techno-strategic discourse can obfuscate, exclude, confuse, and marginalize the important issues by losing sight of the individuals involved. So when we use language like collateral damage, we forget very often that these are real human beings whose lives are involved in this kind of reified language. So the whole question is that the link between what happens internationally and violence against women in the domestic sphere is now established. And we are all familiar with the tension between what often passes as national security and the security of peoples. The security of people's livelihoods and even beliefs, quality of life, including food and water security. And it also establishes the need to link issues of peace and security, as I said earlier, to development in order to address the structural constraints and the structural causes of violent conflict. So what were called the so-called non-traditional security issues, which were meant to belong to the global south, and the traditional security issues about military strength and so on and so forth, which traditionally sat in the global north. This kind of barrier has now been breached thanks to many, many women who have attempted to offer an alternative vocabulary, women and men. So we are moving away from Westphalia now, and in some ways globalization did that to us, but not always in humane, edifying ways. But 1325 did enable us to speak to some of these issues. So if you look at the conflict landscape today, women as refugees, widows, victims, and workers in multiple economic roles without personal or family security have become the new markers of the emerging international scenario. The internal and trans-regional wars that are shaping the global landscape are being fought not only on battlefields at the borders, but also in homes, in cities, and villages. And of these nowhere people, these people on the run, many are women. And the designation stateless is now so commonplace that it excites little comment, even as governments grapple with yet another category of people called permanent liabilities. So any number of these so-called second-class citizens are to be found in almost every country of South Asia and everywhere. And those in a minority, whether linguistic, ethnic, or religious, are vulnerable, and women are doubly vulnerable or doubly disadvantaged. We know about the ubiquity of camps now, especially in South Asia, as in many other parts in Africa, in many other parts of the world. We see them in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Swat, in Jammu. We see them in Sindh, in Pakistan. We see them in Sri Lanka. We see them in Bangladesh. We see them in Nepal for people of Bhutanese origin. We even see some of the remaining camps that the Chinese held in 1962 in India. And we, of course, are familiar with the tragedy of the Rohingya and what happens to them in camps. And camps really are a metaphor for the state of exception where the rule of law is absolutely absent. Here, in a different conception of security, territory trumps humanity and becomes an inverted paradigm of security. The endemic violence of dislocation and involuntary displacement on account of conflicts and climate change within and between borders, and the pervasiveness of camps for rehabilitation or resettlement or even containment have fenced out large segments of people, and they have become invisible. And here we really know the difference between law, niti, and nyaya, justice. And we also know that here the state of exception runs riot. So the growing cultures of militarism, especially in South Asia, and the use of draconian anti-people's acts, even in electoral democracies, has been used to contain dissent. We are familiar with the AFSPA and the carte blanche powers it bestows. TADA has been, of course, now revoked, but with movements ranging from autonomy to independence that we have witnessed in several parts of the world, and of course in some parts of India, in parts of South Asia, whether it was for Tamil Eelam, for the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh, the Tarai region in Nepal, and the Taliban-controlled territory in Afghanistan. What you see is the tension between assertions of ethnicity, religious identity, and the nation-building project. And where law and order is seen as favoring militarism over dialogue and reconciliation, and the attendant wrongful confinement and custodial deaths and rape that follows, the excesses of the militants are met with the might of the state, resulting in the abrogation of the rule of law, and caught between this crossfire of two armed patriarchies are women and children. So as I said, when rules that were made for extraordinary contingencies and as temporary measures become the paradigm of government, the whole notion of security stands questioned or questionable. And here in this slide, you look at the paradox of normalcy. You're looking at voting happening simultaneously in Kashmir, and you see the presence of the helmets there. So this is, in a sense, the paradox of normalcy that we see in our accepted, comfortable, disconcerting notions of security today. But the absence of war does not necessarily mean a secure life for communities, as we know. And the link between security and human development is widely recognized. Development projects cause deaths, injury, loss of property, involuntary displacement, and migration on a large scale that suggest there is a peacetime war where the poor and the marginalized yield, often under coercion, their land, their forests and water, and to industry, to defense projects, or to what is known as infrastructural development. And this is also linked for women in some ways to physical security, also linked to women's experience of domestic and community violence, because even during peacetime, there is a continuum of conflict that women confront. And which is why you notice that women have spearheaded, in our country especially, many movements, several protest movements that are looking at security through a people-centered lens. As the next slide will show you, whether it was the protests at Koel Karo, at the Balyapal missile site, at the Koodankulam protest against Russian-built nuclear plant, and whether it was the Bhopal Gas Tragedy, whether it was the Narmada Jal Satyagrahas, women have come out in large numbers. So the question is a woman's place in the resistance. Women have had so far been invisibilized in terms of their owning this space to reimagine security. I think that is today a thing of the past. Today, women are entering the peace arena through the corridors of human security. And they are interrogating the culture of militarism and militarist models of state security. And it's significant that, Wangari Maathai, who at the Conference for Climate Change at Bali in 2007, had expressed concern that women's voices were largely absent from policy discussions and negotiations around climate change. And this, she said, even as women are disproportionately affected by climate change, and it is they who every day work most directly with the earth and the earth's resources. They are the seed keepers. They're not just the peace builders, they're the seed keepers. They're those who keep our food coming to our table. So if you look at this side of the Chipko movement, you often ask, were Rosa Parks and the women of Chipko doing peace? Or were they doing gender? What unites their work? And this is a question that I leave for all of us to think about, the connections, the interlinkages, and also to recognize that there is a larger feminist consciousness today that is a sort of a palimpsest, and it's almost like a collective unconscious, where activists from different parts of the world write different layers, add different layers to this palimpsest of resistance, of assuming agency, and of also interrogating received structures of power and military might. The next is about the fact that across the globe, in situations of conflict, women and their bodies, the bodies of women, become markers of community honor. And it is often difficult for women to resist the patriarchies of family, state, and community that are arraigned against them. And it has been shown by a number of studies on communal conflict that women are also systematically mobilized by sectarian groups that end up internalizing the value systems of several patriarchs. Now, we are aware of the many stories of women in India and Pakistan during the conflict, during the partition, who jumped into wells to save the honor of their communities. But one of the most dramatic accounts of this was the so-called recovery of abducted women after the Holocaust that followed the partition of India, of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, in which 1 million people perished and over 10 million were displaced in one of the largest so-called peacetime mass migrations of the 20th century. So the Recovery of Abducted Women's Act, and I don't need to go into that, which was really envisioned by very well-meaning people, was to restore women back to their original families, who were women who were abducted or who may have been raped. Very often, these women had established relationships with their so-called abductors, and they were forcibly brought back into one of the biggest, shall I say, I would call it a travesty of women's agency, written into the scripts of nationalism, which built its vocabulary of honor on the bodies of women. The same thing happened with the Bairanganas, or the violated women of the Bangladesh War of Liberation in 1971, where the state snuffed out in some ways their claims to justice in the name of national honor, and somewhat valorizing them simultaneously and ghettoizing them and making them invisible. So the play of identity politics has become so volatile in South Asia that it begs the question, is there a stable national identity? What does nationhood mean? What does it mean for women? And these are questions that we need to ask. And again, I would like to point out the pervasiveness of these difficult questions and the conversations that need to be had in the context of the Rohingya issue and the Rohingya camps today in Cox's Bazar. But without reducing this to an essentialist argument that men make war and women make peace, we all know that war is indeed a gendered activity. But we also know that women have been associated with unspeakable acts of violence. It was actually Soumita who brought home this to me about, I'd say, about 7 years ago, where Jana Plavskik and Pauline Yarmouseko of Jana, of course, was Serbian, and Pauline was the Minister for Women's Affairs in Rwanda when the most unspeakable crimes against women had happened, and they were active participants in the violence that was perpetrated against them during the conflict. We also know about the violence of the women in the Abu Ghraib prison, the Black Widows, the Shahidikis, the female suicide bombers. We also know of the Al-Khansa Brigade of ISIS and the terrorist organization that used women. We know about the assault on Nadia Murad, who was a Yazidi Iraqi human rights activist, who was held by the Islamic State for 3 months. And some of this happens with the complicity of women who have been, in some sense, co-opted into militias. So rape as an instrument of war has now been recognized following the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. It had not been recognized in the Hague Convention nor even in the post-World War Nuremberg chapter, but the Rome Statute, which came into effect in 2002, has closed the gap, and 1325 plus, especially 1820, correct me if I'm wrong, Soumita, have now set this template in stone, declaring rape as a war crime. Now, if we go back to the fact that women who perform very crucial tasks of keeping families alive during situations of conflict often lose their economic guarantees and are excluded from the processes of economic recovery once formal politics takes over and the hostilities end. We are all familiar with the Second World War poster of Rosie The Riveter, which iconized her role during the war effort and the fate of many like her after the war ended, especially in England. So Rosie The Riveter is here for you all to see, and how the women who had actually looked after the factories and been in the front line on the war effort were relegated to their kitchens once the war was over. So the question is, are there enough women at the peace table? Do they participate in negotiations for peace, or are they completely invisibilized once the hostilities are over? This is something that 1325 has foregrounded, and the effort of several, not just UN efforts, but also of women's organizations that work for peace, is to bring more women, make them visible on the peace table. You know that the Dayton Peace Accords, the UN brokered peace accords in 1995, did not have a single Bosnian woman at the table. The Arusha talks were also significantly did not have sizable women's presence. The Chittagong Hill Tracts Agreement in Bangladesh, as Amina Mohsin, a very well-known scholar on peace agreements in Bangladesh, has pointed out, it was a gendered peace that was arrived at when the Shanti Bahini had launched its insurgency post 1977. So the presence of women at official peace negotiations, we know, will undoubtedly place women's needs on the agenda of peace, but their presence in and of itself will not guarantee an engendered discussion. So what is important is to recognize the participation of women not just at the peace table, but around the peace table. Not just the shape of the peace table, but what is brought to the peace table, not just the size of the peace table. In order to ensure an engendered peace, the discussions of the peace table have to be informed by women's democratic participation and the recognition of their presence in formal democratic structures. We all know, for example, that the Gender Subcommittee in Sri Lanka had opened up a world of opportunity. And this step by itself, however, was not adequate in integrating gender into peace building in the Norway brokered peace process in 2002. Because, ironically, the representation of women, one of the most literate states in South Asia, is abysmally low in the parliament in Sri Lanka. So unless Political power is exercised through democratic elected institutions and structures. The impact of having women at the peace table will be significantly, very significantly reduced. So we all, when we talk about moving from conflict to transformation, it is indeed a road less traveled. But increasing numbers of women have embarked on this journey. 2,500 years ago, Aristophanes' heroine Lysistrata, as you know, had announced a sexual strike to persuade the men of Greece to abjure war. But today, women in many parts of the world are already intimately involved in reconciliation processes because they recognize the links between the escalation in private violence and the public violence of armed conflict. For many women all over the world, the distinction between peacetime and wartime is somewhat thin, and they have fought against the cultures of militarism, especially nuclear might. And here you see the women at the Greenham Commons who actually resisted the setting up of a missile base in the Commons. And finally, the success of their mobilization in 1997, the Commons was designated as a public parkland. These are very, very evocative slides of women and their engagement with resistance to armaments and to war. And it must come as something of shall I say, a triumph, if you want to call it that the NPW, the non-proliferation, the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty that came into force early this year has actually, in a sense, it does resonate with many of their concerns. So here, this is another very beautiful image, an iconic image of a woman holding out a flower to the bayonets. And it's been, interestingly, it also was used by some of the women during the Shaheen Bagh protests. So as I said, women often bring very dramatic modes of resistance in their engagement with peace building efforts. They bring, for example, the women of the Greenham Commons pinned the children's diapers and drawings to the missile fence, thus breaching the division between the public and the private sphere. The women of the Madre de la Plaza de Mayo movement protested in the most public square with wearing photographs of their missing children around their neck. Women of the Wajir Peace Group intervened in ethnic conflict in Kenya. And as I mentioned to you, the women in black and the Jerusalem Link were only some of the numerous collectives of disobedient women who have questioned the practices of war making. But there has been, as I said, an efflorescence of women's movements, and they've been largely invisibilized. It's time that we work collectively to make not just their efforts visible, but their voice reverberate across the discussions behind the smoke-filled rooms, these sort of where men in black suits discuss issues of security. As Virginia Woolf had said, the world, as a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world. And therefore, women build transversal solidarities across borders and boundaries. And one of the most spectacular examples of women building peace in the 20th century has been Northern Ireland, where the Roman Catholic Mairead McGurr and the Protestant Betty Williams reached across sectarian lines to establish the People's Peace Movement. And we all know how the Women's Coalition won for themselves a seat at the table and how they did it in a short period of time by collecting signatures across the Protestant Catholic divide. And the Good Friday Agreement, their role in that, and the rest, of course, is history. Women in South Africa, for example, participated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in the subsequent elections that followed, and the whole process of constitution writing. 1 out of 2 representatives per party was a woman in the multi-party negotiation process. And we see that impact in what followed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the coming out of large women speaking out against the horrors of conflict and also of apartheid. So lately, however, women have been calling for a more holistic understanding of their motivation to fight for peace, asserting the need to move beyond the victimhood discourse or the icon of mother sorrow to assert agency and see women as major stakeholders in peace. So if we now come back again, women's participation in the peacekeeping forces, for example. Now this remains a sort of a difficult issue for feminist politics. So how much must women conscript in the formal army? This is an issue that needs debate. There are a lot of ambivalences around this debate, but we do know that the all women peacekeeping force in Liberia, which is really an Indian contingent, went very far in ensuring that the transition to post-conflict was far more humane and took on the voices of women, which hitherto had not happened. We're also familiar with the peacekeeping operations in East Timor, which brought in a very engendered peace. And in the elections that followed, 27% of the assembly constituted women. All I'm trying to say is that peacekeeping, which was initially a blue helmet operation, confined within international humanitarian law, has moved out of that and is also looking more in terms of peace building, of ensuring elections are carried out peacefully, of ensuring that women's voices are brought into the scripting of constitutions. And 1324, the existence of 1325 has made this much easier than before. So when we come to South Asia, we know that reconciliation processes really began from the mid-1990s. Although there were peace-building efforts across borders and boundaries in the global South, Asian women had crossed boundaries much before that. That has somewhat become invisibilized in the contemporary global discourse, and I'm sure Soumita will speak to that. The question is, has 1325 been appropriated as a global North initiative? There are several questions that emerge from that. I won't highlight them now, but we're open to that in the Q&A session. Against the nuclearization projects, both in the Chagai Hills, disarmament groups both in India and Pakistan from the 1998 tests onwards had been active, and women did comprise a large number of that initiative. We are all familiar, as I said, with the Indo-Pak peace bus in May 2000. Subsequently, there were peace buses between India and Bangladesh as well. And what is significant here is that the Women Action Forum in Pakistan, 25 years after 1971, publicly apologized to the women of Bangladesh for their mass humiliation and the mass violence that the Pakistani forces had perpetrated against them. That was not an easy thing to do. In India, we have seen in Manipur, bordering Myanmar, the ferocity of internecine violence between two Kuki tribes, and how women, 5,000 women across the conflict divide, came out on the streets in 1997 to appeal for peace. The most significant example for such an initiative is the Naga Mothers Association. They had a very interesting slogan, "Shed No Blood." And they would ask for a cessation of hostilities between warring ethnic groups. And and also call a day of mourning for people across the conflict divide, no matter which particular group they had personally, shall I say, affiliated with, to call for a day of mourning for the dead. Since then, the Naga Mothers Association has taken on the patriarchal laws even of the tribal community, patriarchal, shall I say, dispensations, and done a great deal to move the women's agenda forward. In Nepal, we know that women constituted a large, about 30% of the Maoist insurgency. But they were also involved in the peace accord after the Jan Andolan in 2006. And the political dispensation that came about after that ensured the presence of women in the parliaments and in the constitution making process. About 27% in the first instance, and today I think there are about 32.7 or so women in the current assembly. However, we must not essentialize this whole idea of women as agents of peace. Women have been involved as combatants. We've seen them as Maoist cadres in Nepal. We've seen them in Sri Lanka and in the LTTE, the women of the LTTE. And there's been a great deal that has been written about whether they were indeed empowered as members of these militia or whether their empowerment was actually ambivalent. Because even within these militia, there were strong patriarchal practices that prevailed, and women were seldom seen in the decision-making roles that they had hoped that they would enjoy. So it is important for us not to essentialize the role of women as purely peacemakers. We are, of course, familiar with Iram Sharmila's protest, and I won't go into that. But if you look at the protest of the Mera Pairis in Manipur, they processioned to protest the rape and killing of a young woman activist, Thangja Manorama, in July 2004. These women, who are the Mera Pairis or the torch bearers, actually in some senses transformed themselves out of victimhood, rejecting masculinist notions and definitions about the appropriation of women's bodies. And they moved into a different paradigm wherein the woman's body is understood as a site of protest. So you can see how powerful that inversion was. As it was in the case of Iram Sharmila, of course, subsequent events we will not go into. But she too used her body in a sort of non-violent way as a site of protest against the military might of the state. Now, there are very powerful symbolic messages here as we try and recover agency. So the experience of 1325 has been very mixed. There are, as I'm sure Soumita will inform us, and a kind of assessment that was undertaken by the UN, by the Rapporteur against Violence Against Women, for Violence Against Women, Radhika Kumaraswamy. She had said that in 2015, her report was actually called Preventing Violence and Ensuring Justice. She had highlighted that while there were some very significant firsts as a result of 1325, there were still several gaps in terms of how many women were actually present at feast tables, how many convictions for rape against women were brought, how many perpetrators were brought to book. And so there is a great deal of work to be done. And if I were to look at some of the current statistics, and I will just take a minute, I'm conscious I've exceeded my time. In the 26 conflict-affected countries, the United Nations today has verified that 102 killings of women's human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists from 2015 to 2019. And this is probably an undercount. The UN has also documented 2,838 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, and 65% of people who are trafficked officially happen to be women and girls. Now, how can we not address the pandemic today? Even as we recognize that women leaders the world over, whether in New Zealand, Germany, Norway, Taiwan, have shown exceptional imagination and compassion when it comes to dealing with issues of refugees, issues of displacement on account of the pandemic, and in fact have been much more effective in their response to these health issues. There still are several gaps in terms of women's representation in national parliaments, and also their ability to influence even COVID-related, health-related, public health-related decision-making. The pandemic and the worldwide lockdown has exposed the enormous value of unpaid care and domestic work for the economy, and how disproportionately this burden is shouldered by women. And in several conflict-affected countries, women perform 3 to 7 times as much unpaid care and domestic work as men. And this is a telling statistic. So when we are looking at weaving the strands together and looking at a suitable discourse that cognizes the gender dimensions of security, the complexities involved must not be overlooked. The positions and interests of women in situations of conflict and also peace building are constantly being constructed, contested, and given new meanings. Women do face a continuum of conflict, a continuum of violence, but victimhood and agency are a complex dynamic. And therefore, in reweaving the stand, in re-problematizing security, we have to resist this linear kind of argumentation where we talk about either victimhood or agency for women. We have to move out of the victimhood discourse, but recognize that this dynamic plays itself against the backdrop of what is known as structural constraints and enabling spaces. While recognizing the structural constraints, also the enabling spaces sometimes that open up in amazing ways, serendipitous ways, when women engage with peace. And so also it's important to ask the question whether patriarchies are reinforced or rejected or merely reinvented in violent movements for liberation and self-determination. But importantly, I think it's important that inclusions and exclusions of women impact upon the quality of peace that we would like to envisage for humanity as a whole. And so we have to move away from the smoke-filled rooms, the reification and the opacity of security establishment by capturing the heat and the dust of subaltern aspirations of the marginalized and placing them squarely within the arena of democratic dialogue and debate, and giving voice to the voiceless and speaking in a new language of connectedness. Luckily, we can take heart from the fact that those who wish to sing will always find a song. And we have seen since 2000, a larger proportion of women's work in peace has been recognized by the Nobel Prizes that have been conferred post-2000. And interestingly, 2000 was when 1325 was enacted. So out of a total of 89 men since 1901, 17 women have won, and 7 of them after 2000. So the times, they are a-changing. And we need to break out of the silence so that women can realize their potential to build a durable, lasting peace. And 1325 does provide us some alphabets, but the language and the scripts have to be constructed from multiple experiences that recognize pluriversality. So I just want to end with a quote which I have often used and which really reflects or resonates with a lot of the work that we have been doing in conflict areas. That peace is really not a target. It is a process. It is a building. It is not a building, but a bunch of possibilities, like a kaleidoscope. It is both robust and fragile. After all, a kaleidoscope is a bit of a cardboard. A few rubber bands, a bunch of broken bangles, sticking hopefully together. Peace is a perpetual hypothesis. It is a matrix of pain and promise, tested and verified each day. A people's peace cannot be an expert's peace. It is a plea, it is an invitation to society to invent and reinvent every day the song of democracy, end quote. And if we look at this reading of the Sustainable Development Goals, which Professor Arjun Kumar has put together for us so beautifully, we place gender equality in the center of the 17 goals for the compact, the global compact, and we see how it impinges upon just about every other goal. So the woods were really made for the hunter of dreams, and the brooks for the fisher of song. To the hunters who hunt for the gunless game, the streams and the woods belong. Thank you ever so much, and for your patience for listening to this long peroration. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, ma'am. So, without any further ado, let me invite our panelists for this very important discussion today. Anshula, would you like to invite? Please go ahead.
Sure. So without further ado, we invite our first panelist for today, Dr. Rina Kashyap, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Lady Shri Ram College for Women. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anshula. Thank you, Dr. Arjun Kumar, for this invite. As you suggested, I will talk about a particular side of women, peace and security, one of post-conflict situations where transitional justice and reconciliation are employed. So I will draw attention to some of the conceptual issues, rather questions that continue to animate the growing literature on transitional justice and reconciliation, and then scrutinize them from a feminist lens very briefly, as Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath has given us a discerning, comprehensive, elegant view of the same. And Soumita Basu's piece on UN Resolution 1325 will also be, sharing insights on the gender perspective. So what I will do is focus on transitional justice and reconciliation and briefly see where gender can really come in. So how do we really understand this field of transitional justice and reconciliation? I propose that the relationship between transitional justice and reconciliation is not a serendipitous but inevitable encounter. Indeed, they now just assume each other. That is transitional justice and reconciliation, yesterday's two discrete concepts, have actually been transformed into a singular cluster concept. Understanding a cluster concept will require us to analyze its elements. So let's start first with transitional justice, which itself is the conjoining of two concepts, transitional and justice. So what is the meaning of transitional? What is in transit? Who is in transit? Is it a society, a group, a community, a country? Feminist perspective draws attention to the fact that all these categories are peopled and that people are gendered. That gender is a relationship, a power relationship. This move is an epistemological reclamation of the human dimension that is often lost in these modern social and political categories. Related questions arise. What does it mean to be in transit? Is it forced? Is it voluntary? What does it entail at the individual level, at the societal level, at the social level? Thus, a critical feminist perspective unpacks, unlayers the concept of transitional itself. Now, what about the concept of justice? Why talk about justice and not simply transitional? And why not just talk about transition from violence to peace? Well, we do so because we realize that we cannot have peace without justice. And then you discover that justice in full measure is not available, that the concept of justice itself has been diluted, it needs to be rethought. One of the epiphanies of such moments is that the penal concept of justice is not a solution for societies emerging from situations of mass violence. And some of the pioneering work in this regard has been done by women scholars such as Martha Minow, Fiona Ross. This epiphany then directs us to the concept of reconciliation, which we had initially hoped to be, to be an outcome of transitional justice. But then we realized that reconciliation is not easy, as the actors, parties involved want penal justice. They're angry, hurt, suspicious, traumatized, and they may want lessons to be taught via punishment so that the violence is never repeated, that potential offenders are deterred. We thus see between these concepts in an intimate relationship. We see these concepts in an intimate relationship in which they jostle, challenge, and mutually constitute each other. Let's go back to the concept of justice for a bit. All transitional justice efforts underline the concept of justice. But the question is the concept of justice itself in transition? Or is justice an inevitable collateral damage in the pursuit of peace, particularly in the first phase of peace, negative peace, whereby justice is stillborn? Or just like Lord Krishna's elder siblings who were sacrificed to pave the way for divinity on earth, justice too, for matters of political expediency, be relinquished for a higher cause. And let's not discount negative peace, because as Thomas Hobbes had pointed out way back in the 17th century, that without this negative peace, there can be no art, no culture, no industry. So in the immediacy of a post-conflict situation, negative peace is an important rite of passage. The challenge is how to ensure that this negative peace and the push towards reconciliation does not lead to justice being stillborn. So one way to avoid the situation of justice being stillborn is to accept that the concept of justice itself is in transition and that the idea of justice has to be redefined. But in order to ensure that the idea of justice is just and not a mockery in transitional justice, we must, in this redefinition of justice, insist on its dynamism, on its movement. What do I mean by this? We don't have to go too far to understand this. Our own Constituent Assembly gives us a roadmap for this. The India of 1950 was transiting from colonialism to independence. The promise of social justice was retained, Chapter 4 of the Constitution, but postponed because of the resource crunch and the political imperatives of a mixed economy. My point being that societies in transition have no choice but to have a dynamic view of justice. The plan or the hope is that the concept of justice will be enriched gradually and surely in full measure, a point that Jawaharlal Nehru makes in his famous Tryst with Destiny speech in the context of the achievement of freedom. So epistemologically speaking, this is a neat, near linear delineation of the process of transitional justice. But we know that in the humdrum and exigencies of everyday politics, this is difficult. And what we see is that justice gets compromised and reconciliation is forced, as in this case of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. In some cases, where Desmond Tutu argued that, well, if you do not forgive, you are not a good Christian. And this is why there are several, like Howard Seher, who argue that, well, if you're forcing the victim to forgive, then this is not restorative justice. So, not surprising then that transitional justice experiments do not result in stable peace and reconciliation. Mahmood Mamdani has pointed this out and regards this as the primary reason why post-apartheid Africa finds itself in these cycles of civil violence. So what can the feminist lens offer to resolve this dilemma? One challenge that critical feminists face is how to retain the radical and emancipatory possibilities of their agenda, how to prevent their arguments from being caricatured as anti-men and angry, aggressive posturing. The challenge is how to ensure that mainstreaming of gender is not its co-option, and at the same time ensure its ubiquitous presence at all tables, including the high table of foreign policy, diplomacy, and peace agreements. Is this aim of ubiquitous presence, something which Dr. Gopinath also referred to, is it too ambitious an aim that is bound to fail? Well, I had a discussion with Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath just a few days ago on this very question. And she pointed out to me that any monochromatic lens is inadequate to address and solve the complex reality of the human condition. So I suggest that the gender lens will have to contextually align itself with other lenses and concepts. What is required by transitional justice in transitional moments of conflict are these forward-looking perspectives from those who have been oppressed, subjugated, and have the empathy to look at the issue from the lens of the subjugated, therefore the utility of this omnibus gender lens. Reconciliation in transitional justice requires subscription to a forward-looking generosity and magnanimity. This outlook, which is rich with courageous idealism sans naivety, but this requires us to also probe what is it that transitional justice is seeking to reconcile. Restorative justice has shown that with adequate preparation and sensitivity to victims' needs and survivors' needs, reconciliation is possible. Studies have shown that the victims, particularly in situations of mass violence, their first demand very often is for dignity and validation of their truth. It is rarely a demand for the punishment or death for the perpetrator. So reconciliation between human beings is possible. It is very much within reach. But if so, why does it elude? Because to borrow from an out-of-fashion philosopher, Karl Marx, human beings are not abstract beings squatting outside the real world. These are human beings situated in structures of race, class, caste. Without addressing these structures, transitional justice mechanisms are engaged in a futile exercise of trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. Positive peace then becomes a chimera, and negative peace acquires a bad name. I'll stop here. Thank you.
So let us move forward, and now let me invite Dr. Soumita Basu, ma'am. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you. Sure. Good evening, and many thanks to IMPRI for organizing this event, and to Dr. Kumar for the kind invitation to contribute. We have a lot to think about from what's already been said by Dr. Gopinath and Dr. Kashyap. And like you, I am keen to hear more from them during the Q&A session. So I'm going to keep my interventions short. My own entry point in this conversation is as an international relations researcher. So in the next 5 minutes or so, I'd like to return to the discussion on the international. Specifically, I would sort of highlight the scope of the international sphere in this discussion on gender, peace, and security. To begin with, let's spotlight women's peace groups in South Asia, whose important work, whose agency Dr. Gopinath presented so eloquently to us in her lecture. Women peacemakers in the region will attest that the issues that they raise in relation to the different ways in which women and men are affected by armed conflicts, and indeed the sustained exclusion of women from formal peace efforts are experiences that are shared across state borders. And when your own community or government is not listening to you, regional and transnational solidarity becomes crucial. Such solidarity, also learning from each other, is evident in the kind of work that WISCOMP, for instance, has been doing for more than 20 years now. On another scale, documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, CEDAW, the Beijing Platform for Action, and indeed Resolution 1325 that I'll go on to discuss in some more detail, provide normative direction by setting standards for gender-based rights. The international can be a useful resource when the local or the national turns repressive. But as we know, the international is not benign. There are echoes of bygone colonial relations with countries from the global north dominating international policymaking. The international arms trade is big business. Economic and cultural globalization too have many local manifestations, evident, for example, in cutbacks in public services or exploitation of natural resources without substantive consultations with local populations. Now, it is against the backdrop of these international power dynamics that I'll briefly review Resolution 1325 and the WPS agenda that Dr. Gopinath discussed in some detail in her lecture. In addition to the sister WPS resolutions, the additional resolutions, we also have national action plans adopted by 92 UN member states for the implementation of these resolutions. This is from the Peace Women website. This number is from June 2021. And there are a host of other regional and international policy documents as well. More broadly, Resolution 1325 appears to have captured international imagination. Dr. Gopinath had touched upon the Nobel Peace Prizes. It is notable in this context that the citation for the Peace Prizes in 2011 and 2018, which focused on women's participations and work against sexual violence against women in conflict, respectively, these included references to Resolution 1325. The question here, however, is what do these documents, what do these pieces of paper entail in practice? And I'll enumerate some successes and limits of the WPS agenda. This is going to be in sort of bullet point format. So if we look at the successes first, what we see now is that there is more gender budgeting, that there are gender offices in UN peace operations. There's also the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict that was established with Resolution 1888. The WPS agenda also now recognizes the need to address sexual violence against men and boys. And I find that quite interesting. It reminds, this is one of my favorite quotes from Cynthia Enloe, that when you see women as women, you also begin to see men as men. So WPS agenda has also drawn to this important, often hidden issue of sexual violence against men and boys in armed conflicts. On On the participation front, there are, of course, more women peacekeepers. It has also spurred, importantly, research, much of it commissioned by, not much, but quite a lot of it by UN Women, that provides evidence that women's participation actually leads to more sustainable peace. I would suggest reading the report authored by Radhika Kumaraswamy that Dr. Gopinath mentioned, because it has lots of important information on this subject. Now, coming to the limitations, well, the first one is that the advances that I've just outlined are actually still quite limited. So, I say budget, there's greater budget for gender-related work, but that budget is still a much smaller percentage of the larger budget. So resources are still scarce. And what we see is, push comes to shove, gender goes down the list of priorities during peace negotiations, as we have seen in the case of Afghanistan. Post-colonial critiques also note that WPS agenda is used against weaker countries. So this whole talk of emancipation and empowerment of women becomes an excuse to intervene, as it were. And there is a larger concern that the WPS agenda is being used to address the symptoms and not really causes of war. So this famous quote by Cora Weiss that 1325 was not about making war safe for women. So these are the two sides of the story, as it were. It is impossible to, just to kind of close my comments, it's impossible to summarize the extensive policy and academic literature on 1325. So I'll just conclude by saying that the Indian government, while not engaging with 1325 domestically, has engaged with the WPS agenda, the UN, in multiple ways. It sent, as again Dr. Gopinath mentioned, the first all-female formed police unit, which was deployed in Liberia in 2007 and celebrated over the last many years. India has also co-sponsored some of the WPS resolutions, and fairly recently donated approximately $300,000 to the UN Department of Field Support to deal with issues of conduct and discipline, which includes concerns about sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers. So if you read the statements by the Indian government, the Indian representatives at the Security Council, we see a fair degree of engagement by India, and with some growing interest in gender-sensitive foreign policy on the part of the Ministry of External Affairs. I presume we'll see more of this engagement with WPS and hopefully gender, peace and security in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. So with that, Meenakshi ma'am, would you like to reflect anything on what our discussants have suggested? Would you like to add anything?
Well, I think they have added so many rich layers of insight to a rather, I'd say, initial sketchy presentation that I made. But I was particularly struck by this issue of transitional justice. In fact, the whole process of transiting, where the dialectic of restorative, retributive justice, punishment, and so on comes into play. And I would really like to know, I do recognize that South Africa still carries the wounds of the process and a sense of non-completion through the TRC and the demands that the TRC made on women. But there are equally stories of some kind of recompense that was offered to those who were in deep distress through that process. However, I agree entirely with Rina when she says that asking women to forgive in a process is really not justice, as I think Howard Zeher pointed out. So as you said, justice is constantly in the making and the remaking. as is peace. And Radhika Kumaraswamy's proposals were really about bringing justice as a major element into the whole discourse on women, peace and security. I also take Soumita's point that we have to move beyond the WPS to the GPS agenda, where we talk about gender more frontally and not just about women. And that what we are talking about is masculinities, toxic masculinities that affect both men and women in conflict, and how, and not just in conflict, in everyday life as we play out the patriarchal diktat both in domestically and internationally. I had a couple of questions though, and maybe they'd like to explicate on that. Soumita, I've often wondered what a gender-sensitive foreign policy would look like, because there's been a great deal of talk, especially post Hillary Clinton's Clinton doctrine, about feminist foreign policy. What would be the contours of a so-called feminist foreign policy, or is that a misnomer? And Rina, I would also like to ask you whether the word transitional injustice itself is a misnomer, and how do we address that, and what kind of a more, shall I say, appropriate or apposite phrasing of this process will serve the purpose for us as we talk about the trajectory from prevention to management to reconciliation and to positive peace. But thank you both for those insights. They've been truly illuminating. Thank you.
Rina, ma'am, would you like to go first?
Okay.
Okay,
sure. For me, the answer would lie in what you have just spoken, which is about peace. Being a process. It's not an event, and it's going to be long drawn out. I think here. Like I did, when I first looked at transitional justice, even I felt that this adjective is not appropriate to talk about justice. But then when you discover that, well, what they are really concerned with is societies in transition. And so the two may not sit very well, but they're talking about societies in transition. And these societies in transition, and this is why I went back to India of 1950s. So if you have a Gandhi who's now going to transit from colonialism to independence, he obviously had, he could have given you justice on that very first day. But the fact, it is not Gandhi, it is, a modern India in the, completely, when I say modern, I mean, not authentically modern the way Gandhi would have visualized it, but keeping in mind the limitations of that modernity, westernization, that transition did give you a resource crunch, and you therefore postponed, you segmented the idea of justice. So I think this goes back to your point about unless and until we address those structures of violence, whether it is that of caste or class or race, uh, justice is going to be problematic. So how would, I think for me now, the concern is not so much with the nomenclature, transitional justice, but it is more about the agenda of transitional justice and whether, therefore, the feminist lens can do something about changing that agenda. I think now, after so many years, I'm okay with the word transitional if it's referring to societies in transition. But the important question really to ask is, what are we transiting to? I think that, and I'm sure you have an answer. You could, you could in fact, say what your thoughts are on this, Soumita, and you perhaps.
Soumita, over to you for your.
Thank you. on the question on gender-sensitive foreign policy, of course, this is more popularly referred to as feminist foreign policy and associated with Sweden. So I think Sweden, in their formal policy, they offered a good starting point when they talked about rights of, in the foreign policy, focusing on rights of women, representation of women, and resources. So, giving resources for this kind of work. So the 3 R's that is associated with the Swedish feminist foreign policy, that's a great starting point. However, in some, and it's interesting, this, I'm so glad that we're talking about this sort of feminist and gender sensitive foreign policy, because of course, some countries might not want to use the word feminist for all the issues associated with it. Not going too much into the nomenclature, there are 2 things that I would hope that these countries would pay attention to, and that would include India. One is when your feminist foreign policy comes up against your other foreign policy interests, as has happened in the case of Sweden or France or Canada, where you're on the one hand talking about feminist foreign policy, and on the other hand, big arms exporters. So that works against this idea of feminist foreign policy. And the second is that when we talk about foreign policy, it needs to, those ideas need to reflect in your domestic policy, because that is what will give your foreign policy legitimacy. So I think those 2 aspects in terms of how feminist foreign policy is practiced and contextualizing feminist foreign policy, those become important. But again, I'd love to hear from the both of you on this.
I remember you're convening a very, very interesting conference at the South Asia University on feminist diplomacy. And it threw up a lot of these questions. And of course, it is always a conversation in progress. And how you nuanced it, and especially I particularly enjoyed the ideas that you have brought out in your book on 1325, which impinges on a whole host of questions on how we frame these issues through a so-called feminist lens. Ultimately, a feminist lens should not be exclusionary in any way. It has not to repeat the problems of a non-feminist lens. And therefore it cannot reduce itself or essentialize itself to another ism, which is exclusionary. I assume that would be the basic starting point of feminism. But Arjun, I think we've all outdone our time, and you have your imperatives as well. So
I'll just just point out one bit of information. There is this work done by four researchers, and they came out with a book called Sex and World Peace, in which they actually collected data. So there is empirical data whereby they say that the more violent a state and its citizens are towards its women, the more violent a state is, not just internally, but also externally in its dealings with the rest of the world. That the best predictor of a state's peacefulness is how well it treats its women. The fact that this is based on empirical data gives us some hope to argue for a feminist foreign policy.
Of course, we are all conscious that formally India has not adopted 1325, as Soumita said, because that would also involve a recognition that there are conflicts. And most countries that have not adopted it are formally afraid of or are hesitant to accept the prevalence of conflict. And there are only 92 countries in the world that have adopted national action plans. And there too, there is a difference in the way in which the global north responds to or envisions national action plans on women, peace and security, and the global south responds. In Asia, of course, we have only 2 countries. Nepal was the first, I assume. Am I right, Soumita? And then it was Afghanistan. But it's interesting that although women in Afghanistan have 27% representation, Many of these sub-councils are actually, of the 33 councils, 32 are headed by men. So it's an interesting, it's not a men versus women story at all. It's actually about how we look at inclusion and how equitable these processes for peace building can be, and how we can reframe a more people-centric, inclusive understanding of what constitutes security. I think
just one question, since ma'am also touched upon pandemic and other things, I thought to just ask. There are also concerns, especially during this pandemic. Countries are also becoming very inward, or what we are saying in our terms, Atmanirbhar, be it China or be it any other major nations, and other concerns other than the traditionally security measures, non-traditional security measures are also coming at the fore. So I just thought that if our panelists can touch upon this dimension, that how do you see this decade is also called the decade of action, how we are moving forward on the subject gender, peace and security in a more broader context of the pandemic. Rina ma'am, would you like to take that?
I haven't, really thought about it, though I was recently pushed by somebody to think about responsibility to protect and the pandemic, because responsibility to protect is my is what my doctoral thesis is on. And I wasn't too sure how to deal with it, but I was surprised that there is a lot of work which is being done in that regard. The International Studies Association has several panels in the coming conference next year, which is looking at these issues. I haven't really quite thought about it, except something similar to what Dr. Gopinath mentioned about how women leaders have responded to the crisis, and what would a feminist question really be about the pandemic? I think the feminist question would be that they will not look at the vaccine as a panacea. They will ask you questions about how did the pandemic become possible, and how did a disease become a pandemic? And then you say globalization. And then why this globalization? What is this globalization packed with? Why, whose footprint, whose carbon footprint do we see? Is there of the migrant workers, it is there of the tourists. I think then we are going back to that issue again about structures. Unless, so a feminist lens on the pandemic will draw attention to that. So I'm sort of still thinking about this. That's all that comes to my mind, that would be the feminist question. Yeah.
Great. Dr. Soumita Basu, ma'am, would you like to say?
Again, just like Dr. Kashyap, I'll connect this to my own area of research, which is the UN Security Council. So if we look at the two resolutions on COVID that the UN Security Council has, there are references to women. So that's heartening to see that, so we are talking about a non-traditional security issue because we are talking about health security. At the Security Council on gender, and this is all coming together. So there is recognition that women are affected in particular ways, and also that women's participation and their efforts to alleviate the problems that have arisen from COVID should be supported. But interestingly, what we see is that, and this is just a quick point that I'll make, that the controversial July 1st COVID resolution, which of course we know was controversial because US and China couldn't agree on what it should be called and whether WHO should be mentioned. It's a 2-page resolution, and it has a very long paragraph on civil society, and that includes women. And the more recent one, which was adopted in February, if I recall correctly, that's a much longer resolution, 4 pages, a lot of details on vaccination, etc., etc. And there, the reference women is just like one line. So, when it comes to doing stuff, when it comes to actually setting out concrete provisions, we find that, women kind of lost out on that space. So those are the kind of issues that we need to be paying attention to, that, we should not just be talking about gender and women's participation, but making sure that when there's a call to action, that we recognize and support the work that's being done by women. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Arjun, may I come in here?
Yes, please.
It's interesting that you raised this whole issue of non-traditional security. I think post-COVID, the entire vocabulary on international peace and security will be reconfigured, and it probably will have to do so. For one reason, I think this artificial divide between traditional and non-traditional security will have to go, because it was envisaged at a time just after the Cold War, where it was assumed that traditional security really sat in the global north and the non-traditional security issues sat in the global south. Right? Issues of livelihood, water, poverty, unemployment, disease, and so on. Now that has been it's actually sort of blown in the face of recent happenings. I also would like to suggest to you that this method of phrasing issues of security should be rethought. We should have non-traditional approaches to security. There is no such thing, to my mind, as non-traditional security anymore. There can be non-traditional approaches to security or traditional approaches to security, which would be Westphalia, realism, and so on. We have to look at non-traditional approaches to security, which meet the current challenges that humanity confronts across borders and boundaries. And just to come back to your question on COVID, I think the ILO's latest data shows that the COVID pandemic has ensured that the employment losses are much larger for women than for men. And that in response to the COVID crisis, there were more than 417 policy measures that were enacted by national governments in 42 conflict-affected countries, and with data, but with very few measures that addressed unpaid care work. Very few measures. And I think this whole issue of refugees, of forced migration, of displacement, alongside the pandemic, I think the feminist question on the pandemic, as you said, will be important. How we are going to frame this issue will be crucial in the coming years. And perhaps that is the way in which interventions through a feminist lens on foreign policy will find its greatest traction in the years to come. To some extent, with SARS and so on, the Southeast Asian countries had addressed this as a major security issue. So it was no longer a non-traditional. So my plea would be, I think we need to dispense with this traditional and non-traditional security, but traditional and non-traditional approaches to security would be. I don't know if that answers your question. Thank you.
Arjun, if you had more time, I would have asked you to ask Dr. Gopinath more questions, because I haven't heard her in a very long time. So it's always so much of learning.
It's already covered for everyone, and I think we should.
Great. So, Anshula, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
If you suggest we can have a bit of science.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all.
Right, so there seems to be a slight connectivity issue.
I can hear you now.
It's always a good signal to wind up. There is a saying in the south of India that before your voice begins to break, you should stop the song.
That's beautiful. So I think,
Yes.
yes, I think, yes. So I think we can move towards wrapping up today's discussion, conversation. And so just once formally, on behalf of the IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for this distinguished lecture on gender, peace, and security. I would like to thank our speaker for today, Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath, for taking out the time to share her thoughts, her insights with us today. Thank you, ma'am. And I would like to thank our panelists, Dr. Rina Kashyap and Dr. Soumita Basu. You've really left us, especially some of us young students and researchers, with a lot to think about, a lot to learn from. So thank you. I would like to thank everyone who joined us as viewers here on Zoom or on Facebook. Thank you very much for joining us. And we hope to see you in our future episodes of the Gender Gap series as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to Soumita, Rina, Professor Arjun Kumar, Anshula, and the team at IMPRI, Ishika. It's been a great pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, have a nice evening. Thank you. Please.